Don't be fooled by the colored maps. A war like this isn't decided by a few kilometers. It's decided by endurance, by cash flow, by whether your friends keep showing up when the headlines get boring. Moscow's real edge has never been momentum on the front line, it's leverage and patience, and today two quiet signals suggest both are being shaved down at the same time. One is about energy, and it's already being locked behind law. On January 26, 2026, EU governments moved to sign off a phased ban designed to end imports of Russian gas on a fixed timeline, LNG first, pipeline gas later, with only narrow temporary exceptions. Not everyone applauded. A few capitals warned about costs and supply shocks because politics always hates hard deadlines, but the important part isn't the argument on TV. It's that the exit is being written into a schedule that is meant to survive elections, mood swings, and one brutal winter. When a timetable becomes binding, it stops being a threat and starts being a trap. To understand why that matters, remember what Russian energy was in this war. It wasn't just revenue. It was a remote control for European decision-making, the kind that works without firing a shot. Prices jump, factories complain, voters panic, parties fracture. Suddenly unity looks expensive. Moscow didn't need Europe tool of Russia, it only needed Europe to doubt itself for long enough. Energy was the wedge under the door, and every cold season was the moment you could hear the wood creak. Now the door is being reinforced, not with speeches but with paperwork. A step-by-step ban is harder to game than a single dramatic cutoff because it closes loopholes on the way out, new contracts, then short-term deals, then the long tail that keeps dependency alive. It also forces a new kind of scrutiny, traceability, reporting, monitoring, so that Russian volumes can't just put on a new label and stroll back in through a side gate. Think of it like sealing a leaking pipe. You don't just tighten one bolt, you work the whole line until the pressure stops finding weak spots. And if you're following this story, do yourself a favor, share claims responsibly, stick to verified outlets, and remember that sanctions talk can be misinformation-prone and legally sensitive in some jurisdictions. The reasonable Eagle timeline hits harder than a loud sanctions headline is psychological. Markets and ministries don't wait for the ban to arrive. They start pricing it in, building workarounds, signing new supply deals, rehearsing the exit. When buyers believe you'll be there forever, they design their whole system around you. When buyers believe you're leaving, they spend money to make leaving painless. A law turns maybe into a date, and a date turns fear into planning. Those alternatives don't need to be perfect, they just need to be believable enough that a leader can say, "We can get through the winter," and not get laughed out of office. Once that sentence becomes credible, Moscow can't trigger instant panic the way it used to. The leverage shifts from emergency pressure to long-haul discounting, and discounts are a slow bleed. It's a blade that doesn't look dramatic on the map, but it keeps cutting every month. That's why the rhetoric gets louder right as the tool gets weaker. Yes, Russia can still sell energy elsewhere, and it will try, because it has to, but that's not the same thing as holding Europe hostage. Leverage is about timing and concentration. One buyer, one region, one winter panic, one phone call that changes a vote, spread those barrels and molecules across distant markets, and the power changes shape. Discounts deepen, shipping gets messy, middlemen take a cut, and the political knife gets blunt. The map might still show Russia exporting, but the export no longer buys the same silence, the same hesitation, the same "maybe we should slow down" in Brussels. That's the first signal. A padlock clicking shut on the tool Moscow used best, and here's where it gets uncomfortable, because energy was only half the game. The other half was the bet that Ukraine's supporters would tire first, that Western politics would wobble, that attention would drift, that aid would come in waves and then in excuses. On January 26, 2026, President Zelensky said a U.S.-Ukraine security guarantees agreement was 100 ready, waiting for a signing date and then ratification. That's not a headline designed to impress you. It's a message to Moscow that the calendar is being weaponized in the opposite direction. If the first lock is money, the second lock is time, and when both locks close together, the advantage everyone keeps pointing at on the map starts to look like something else entirely, something that can't be fixed with one offensive or one winter or one new threat. That's why the line from Kyiv on January 26, 2026 matters. Zelensky said a U.S.-Ukraine security guarantees agreement was 100 ready, waiting for a signing date and then ratification. People hear that and think it's just another headline, another promise that will fade. But once something moves toward ratification, It stops behaving like a podium promise and starts behaving like policy. It survives leadership changes, budget fights, and the next crisis on the news cycle. For Moscow, that is poison, because delay only works when you can bet on people quitting. Because Moscow's favorite battlefield isn't the trench. It's the calendar, the space between elections and budget votes, between one shock and the slow return of focus at home. The play is simple. Keep the war expensive, keep it noisy, and let democratic societies argue themselves into paralysis. You don't have to defeat an army if you can exhaust attention and patience. That's why every month matters, and why Moscow keeps betting on fatigue instead of miracles. A written guarantee is more threatening than 1,000 speeches, because it turns "we'll see" into "we're committed." And once commitment hardens, planning changes on both sides. Ratification is boring, and that's the point. It drags a war out of emotion and into machinery. Ministries start building frameworks instead of improvising packages, and continuity becomes a feature, not a favor. When lawmakers tie themselves to a commitment, support becomes less of a charity and more of a system. Even if the numbers don't jump overnight, predictability alone is a weapon. It tells Ukraine's planners to assume continuity, and it tells Russia's planners to assume resistance. The wait them out theory turns into a math problem with fewer unknowns, and that's when alliances stop fraying as easily. Now put that next to what Europe is doing with gas. Moscow spent decades turning molecules into influence, with discounts that became dependencies and technical disputes that became political knives. A stepwise ban flips that script because it forces Europe to practice life without Russian supply before the final cutoff arrives. It's not one dramatic severing. It's a slow removal of the crutch until you can't limp back. So while one document steadies the coalition's time horizon, another narrows Russia's money horizon. Different tools, same effect. The room to manipulate gets smaller, and the battlefield starts looking less like a map and more like a ledger. And notice the diplomatic tone shifting around it. German officials have been openly describing Russia as rigid on territorial questions, not as a partner searching for a landing, but as a side trying to grind time into concessions. That matters because a negotiation isn't just about terms. It's about whether people believe there is a deal at all. When your reputation becomes inflexible, your leverage shrinks because even your threats start sounding like stalling. You can't play the long game if everyone stops betting you have an endgame. The exit narrows, the door swings inward, and suddenly delay feels less like strategy and more like confinement. Then there's the part that doesn't get drawn on those colored maps. The rear, in Russia's Krasnodar region, drone debris has sparked fires at industrial sites, a reminder that safe depth is an assumption, not a guarantee. Even when air defenses work, the very act of defending costs money, manpower, and attention, and it forces hard choices about what gets protected first. A refinery, a power node, a rail line, a warehouse, each one becomes a new security bill, and once the rear starts absorbing pressure, the front becomes harder to feed. Distance stops being free when every kilometer needs guarding. That's the hidden tax of a war that spreads outward, so the squeeze isn't theoretical. If energy revenue gets discounted and rerouted, if sanctions pressure tightens around the channels that keep cash moving, the state has less room to buy time with money. At the same time, if the West's support becomes more predictable, Russia loses the hope that one political storm will do the job for them. Add the growing cost of defending the rear, and you get a familiar trade-off. Every ruble spent shielding Krasnodar is a ruble not spent on artillery, mobilization, or incentives. This is how strategic depth turns into strategic drag, and drag is deadly in a war built on endurance. Which is why the next move from Moscow probably won't look like a surrender. It will look like substitution, more information operations designed to make Europeans doubt their own plan, more economic pressure aimed at the weakest links, more peace talk theater to split audiences, more strikes meant to remind Ukraine that suffering can be scaled. But the underlying problem won't change. Both of the old levers, the money lever and the time lever, are being tightened at once. And when that happens, choices get sharper, faster, uglier. In the next few weeks, watch less for where Russia advances, and more for what they try to break. That pincer is why the map can look redder while Moscow is actually getting weaker where it counts. On January 26, 2026, EU countries gave final approval to rules that phase out Russian gas imports on a fixed timeline. LNG gets pushed out first, pipeline gas later, and that stepwise split matters more than the headline, because leverage is not just money, it is uncertainty, and uncertainty dies when deadlines become law. A door held open by politics is one thing, but a door bolted by regulation is another. For 2 years Moscow treated energy like a remote control for European unity. Prices spike, nerves fray, and someone starts whispering about compromise. But once companies and governments plan around a ban, panic stops being negotiable currency. You can still sell molecules elsewhere, sure, but you cannot easily sell political fear to a customer who already booked alternatives. That is why this kind of legal lock is a slow knife, not a sudden blow. It does not win a battle, it just makes every winter stunt worth less each time. Now put that next to the other lever Russia loves: time, the hope that the West gets bored before Ukraine breaks. The same day, Zelensky said a U.S. security guarantees document was 100% ready and waiting for a signing date, then ratification. That changes the psychology of support, because paperwork is harder to reverse than vibes. Russia can still bet on elections and distractions, but the bet gets more expensive when commitments are written for years, not news cycles. Endurance is not bravery, it is cash flow plus credibility, and both are being squeezed. Then there is the quieter sign that the hallway is narrowing. Even Germany is openly calling Russia stubborn on maximalist territorial demands. When exit ramps disappear, the strategy of dragging things out stops feeling clever and starts feeling trapped. A small rule for staying sane: separate verified reporting from commentary. And don't share claims you can't source. Misinfo travels faster than missiles, because the real asset in geopolitics is trust, and trust dies first in the margins. The more Moscow looks rigid, the more partners quietly plan for a world where Moscow cannot deliver what it promised. And while diplomats argue, the rear is starting to feel the war too, with authorities reporting drone debris sparking fires in Russia's Krasnodar region. One night of alarms is not collapse, but it is a dead weight. Detail because it forces air defense and repairs to compete with the front. Depth only helps when it feels free, and the moment it stops feeling free, it becomes another meter on the cost dashboard. So the three hard takeaways are simple. Europe is locking the energy lever, Washington and Kyiv are locking time, and Russia's backyard is getting pricier to defend. Not dramatic, just directional, and direction is what wins long wars. Over the next 2 to 8 weeks, expect Moscow to hunt for any loophole that slows those locks. Because schedules are harder to intimidate than politicians. If EU implementation accelerates, Russia will likely lean harder on substitute tools: propaganda, economic pressure, and calibrated escalation that tries to raise costs without crossing a clear red line. If a signing date for the US-Ukraine document appears, the signal is continuity, and continuity is poison to a waiting strategy. If the rear keeps taking hits, even small ones, Russia will have to decide what it protects first: exports, civilians, or prestige. Every answer costs money, and money is exactly what sanctions and isolation were designed to drain. That is why, strange as it sounds, Ukraine's resistance is not only defense, it is pressure on an entire ecosystem of tyranny. Autocracies survive by looking inevitable, and inevitability is a story, not a fact. When Europe locks energy lawfully, when the US puts guarantees on paper, that story starts to crack at the edges. Russia can still be dangerous while the story cracks, sometimes even more dangerous, because desperate systems lunge. But history is brutal about one thing: systems that must spend more for the same output eventually run out of slack, and once the slack is gone, the world suddenly remembers that fear was never a strategy, it was a tax. So I'm not selling you do more victory laps, I'm saying the advantage disappears first in the invisible places, then the front line follows. If you want one simple habit, watch what gets locked, not what gets shouted. Tell me below which lock matters most right now: energy leverage, the waiting game, or the rear. Just type 1, 2, or 3. And if you want more independent, mechanism-first analysis, subscribe, because quiet structural shifts matter more than loud daily drama. Support Ukraine in whatever concrete, legal way you can, because freedom survives when ordinary people keep choosing it over intimidation.